My stepmom called CPS on my dad after I exposed her abuse in front of the whole family, then told everyone she's just dramatic. When I told her I had photos of the bruises, she went pale and whispered, "You wouldn't dare." I stayed silent. That was 10 months ago. This morning, she was screaming at her lawyer in the courthouse lobby while her sons refused to look at her. My stepmom gave me one rule when she moved in with my dad and I. If I had time to lean, I had time to clean. She demanded that I be productive at all times. And I mean at all times. That meant I had to text, call, or email her showing her with proof that I was being productive with timestamps. She said it was the only way to hold me accountable with no excuses. At the end of every day, she had her computer ready with the family spreadsheet for me to log in. The whole purpose of this all was to make sure I wasn't wasting my life away. I followed her dumb rule at first, mainly out of curiosity. And on the first day she checked, she bent me over and slapped my behind with a leather tool for every hour that I was unproductive. Meanwhile, her two sons could play FIFA all day with no consequences. And I was already an overachiever, the type to feel like I was a failure unless I got all A's. So this only made it worse. And it wasn't until 3 months later that I finally saw through her BS. Because one day, after I had an extremely productive 24 hours, she still slapped me. The reason? For eating lunch for 15 minutes without making it productive through multitasking. But I didn't stop following her rule. In fact, I followed it even more. Because if Stella wanted to track every single hour of my day, I would do just that. I started tracking absolutely everything. And I mean everything. I logged the Excel sheet with BS like 7:23 p.m. to 7:24 p.m., productive blinking session, maintained eye moisture for optimal vision, 10:15 a.m. to 10:30 a.m., productive oxygen exchange via breathing, converting oxygen to carbon dioxide. At first, I could tell it made her eyes twitch with stress, but she was able to brush it off and calm herself down, so I upped my game. I started spamming her with texts all day to ensure what I was doing was productive. "Hey Stella, do you think I should read Wuthering Heights or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde during lunch today? How long do you think I should take in the bathroom if I'm taking a number 2 while slightly constipated? Productivity alert, currently producing saliva at an above average rate. The day is going well." At the end of each day during our productivity review sessions, I would present slideshows about what I did in between each bite of food I took, every thought I had while walking to and from school, and every word that me and my friends exchanged, rating them all from 1 to 10 on a productivity scale, deciding how many times Stella should hit me. I would drag them out until she was so tired she fell asleep. And as soon as she did, I'd shake her awake and tell her we weren't being productive if she wasn't listening to me. When her parents came to visit, I interrupted every few minutes with a question. "Sorry, Stella, but I've been awake for almost 30 hours trying to be productive. Is it okay if I sleep for a little bit, or is that too unproductive? I'm gonna play an audiobook while I sleep." Her parents glared at her, not knowing if it was a joke. Her mom even asked if I was on the spectrum. The breaking point came at a family reunion 3 months later. It was me, my dad, my stepmom, and both of their sides of the family. Right when everyone was eating and the garden was silent, I came running out in tears. "Stella, I'm sorry! I just realized that when I went to the bathroom, I didn't bring any reading material with me, which makes me a lazy piece of shit like you always say." She tried to laugh it off as a joke, but that's when I took out the leather tool she hit me with and bent over in front of her. "Just hit me! I deserve it this time." Her mom gasped. My grandparents on my dad's side looked like they were about to faint. "What the F is going on?" my grandmother said. Before Stella could answer, I responded with, "Oh, I'm just not being productive right now, so I'm asking Stella to punish me like she always does." Stella's face turned ghost white. That's not what," she stammered. "Oh, I have photos of the bruises if you need documentation," I exclaimed. "I've been productively documenting everything like Stella taught me. Should I go get them?" Her father stood up. "Bruises? What bruises?" Even my dad, for the first time, finally spoke up. "I think it's time for you to leave," he said, turning to Stella. She didn't even fight it. She knew she couldn't. And with that, she finally left. The rest of the barbecue was pretty awkward after that, and everyone made excuses for why they had to go home. And TBH, I felt like a winner. It was the moment I had been dreaming about ever since Stella first moved in. The next day at school, the creepy guidance counselor pulled me aside and demanded that I lift up my sleeves. I hesitated, but he grabbed my arm and did it himself. That's when he was faced with the bruises. "Your stepmom was right. Your dad has been hitting you." I tried explaining through tears that it wasn't my dad, but the counselor wouldn't listen. He dragged me down the hallway toward the principal's office, his grip tight on my wrist. My heart pounded as we burst through the door. The principal sat behind his desk with 2 police officers and a woman in a gray suit standing beside him. The counselor pushed me into a chair. The woman in gray stepped forward. She introduced herself as a CPS worker and explained they'd received a call about suspected abuse. My stomach dropped. Stella had called them. She'd planned this whole thing. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands, scrolling through thousands of productivity texts. The CPS worker took it, her eyebrows rising as she read. She looked at the officers, then back at me. She set the phone down carefully. Her voice turned gentle but firm. These detailed logs showed clear signs of coercion. Someone had forced me to write them. The elaborate documentation actually proved abuse, not disproved it. The principal called my dad. 20 minutes later, he rushed through the door looking confused and worried. Before he could speak, the officers moved toward him. I jumped up, screaming that Stella had done this, begging them to check my logs properly. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists. He stared at me in shock as they read him his rights. The CPS worker explained I'd be placed in emergency foster care while they investigated. My phone would be kept as evidence. Everything happened so fast. They loaded me into a car while my dad got put in the back of a police cruiser. Through the window, I saw him mouthing that he loved me. The foster home smelled like vanilla candles and cat litter. The couple seemed nice enough, showing me to a small bedroom with faded superhero wallpaper. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed, everything clicked. Stella knew exactly what would happen. She'd studied psychology, specialized in troubled youth. She knew they'd assume it was my father. The next morning at school felt surreal. Kids whispered as I walked past. During lunch, Brady and Marcus approached my table. Brady smirked while Marcus looked uncomfortable. They told me their mom said hi from their new apartment. She'd filed for emergency custody of them, claiming our household was violent. My hands clenched into fists. She'd gotten everything she wanted. Her sons back, my dad in jail, and me trapped in foster care, all because she knew how the system worked. That afternoon, my dad's lawyer called the foster home. He couldn't discuss details but asked to speak with me briefly. When I got on the phone, he told me to keep documenting everything, then hung up quickly. I found a notebook in my backpack and started writing. Day 1, separated from my dad, who never hurt me because of my stepmom. stepmom who did. The words looked strange on paper, like they belonged to someone else's life. My foster parents, Catherine and Jonathan, made spaghetti for dinner. They asked gentle questions about school and my interests. When I mentioned what happened, Catherine exchanged a look with Jonathan. They'd fostered other kids who protected abusive parents. It was common, they said. Kids often covered for the people who hurt them. I wanted to scream that they had it backwards, but I stayed quiet. Who would believe me? The next few days blurred together. I discovered I could still access my cloud storage from the school computers. All my productivity spreadsheets were there. Months of documentation. But when I looked closer, I found new entries I hadn't written. Entries dated weeks ago, describing concerning aggression from me. My blood ran cold. Stella had added them after leaving. Brady started texting from a burner phone. His messages were short but chilling. If I told the truth about what really happened, his mom would release recordings. What recordings? Then I remembered all those productivity review sessions. She'd been recording them. Audio of her hitting me that would sound like a man doing it. The CPS worker scheduled an interview. I brought printed spreadsheets, hoping she'd see the pattern. Instead, she focused on why my father had made me document everything. Every piece of evidence I showed got twisted. The more I tried to explain, the more it looked like I was covering for him. My grandparents on my dad's side hired a private investigator. He uncovered something that made my skin crawl. Stella had done this before. 3 previous stepchildren. 3 different states. Same productivity rules, same outcome. Fathers blamed and jailed while she walked free. They tracked down one of her previous stepkids. When I heard about him, my heart sank. He wouldn't talk to anyone about what happened. The investigator said he showed signs of lasting trauma. His only advice was to let her win because fighting made it worse. My foster siblings had their own horror stories about the system failing them. They'd seen kids return to abusive homes, watched real victims get ignored while innocent people got punished. The girl in the room next to mine had been in 12 different homes. Talk about productivity taken to its logical extreme. Stella managed to weaponize Excel spreadsheets and turn time management into psychological warfare, while her own kids played video games all day. She told me proving the truth was almost impossible once CPS made up their minds. Dad's bail hearing arrived. I wasn't allowed to go, but Jonathan drove me past the courthouse. Through the car window, I saw Stella walking up the steps in a conservative dress, playing the concerned witness perfectly. She'd probably brought those edited recordings. That night, my grandmother snuck a visit while my foster parents were at the grocery store. She slipped me a cheap prepaid phone and hugged me tight. She believed me, she said. So did my grandfather. They knew my dad would never hurt anyone. She told me to keep fighting before Catherine's car pulled into the driveway. I hid the phone under my mattress and spent hours researching Stella online. Her psychology degree came from a good university. Her thesis had focused on intervention strategies for troubled youth. She understood the system inside and out, every bias, every assumption. She'd weaponized her education against us. Brady's Instagram story popped up on the hidden phone. For just a moment before he deleted it, I saw Stella in their new apartment. She stood next to a trash can fire in their backyard, throwing in what looked like my belongings. The caption read, "Erasing the problem child," with a laughing emoji. I managed to screenshot it before it vanished. Evidence, finally. But the next morning, Catherine found the phone during a routine room check. The disappointment in her eyes hurt more than anger would have. Trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild. They confiscated the phone and said we'd need to discuss boundaries. The screenshot was gone with the phone. Another piece of evidence lost. Stella stayed 3 steps ahead while I stumbled in the dark, trying to prove a truth no one wanted to hear. The therapy session started the following week. Catherine drove me to a small office building downtown, where Dr. Peterson waited with a practiced smile. She specialized in trauma recovery for foster children, Catherine explained during the ride. The sessions were mandatory for all kids in the system. Dr. Peterson's office had motivational posters and a box of tissues on every surface. She asked about my feelings towards Stella, but every answer I gave got reframed. When I described the productivity torture, she nodded sympathetically and asked why I felt angry enough to create such elaborate stories about my stepmother. When I showed her photos of the bruises on my phone that Catherine had returned for the session, she gently suggested that self-harm often manifested in abuse victims who needed to externalize their pain. I realized Stella had probably coached her. The questions all led in the same direction, pushing me to admit my father was the real abuser. Dr. Peterson kept circling back to my misplaced anger and protective feelings toward him. By the 3rd session, I stopped trying to convince her. I gave vague answers and stared at the clock, counting down the minutes. My friends from school tried visiting the foster home, but Catherine turned them away. They might interfere with my healing process, she explained. The isolation felt deliberate, cutting me off from anyone who might believe my version of events. I watched from my bedroom window as they walked away, shoulders slumped in defeat. The news about Dad's upcoming trial date arrived through his lawyer. A brief phone call informed me that Stella would serve as the prosecution's key witness. My stomach churned as I processed this information. She'd orchestrated everything perfectly, positioning herself as the brave stepmother who'd exposed an abusive household. That evening, I found Stella's Facebook page on the foster home computer during homework time. She'd made it public, probably intentionally. Post after post detailed her survival story and escape from domestic violence. Hundreds of supportive comments flooded each update. People called her brave, inspiring, a hero for protecting children. The most recent post included a link to a local news article. The headline made my hands shake. Brave stepmother exposes abusive household, saves children from violent father. They'd blurred my face in the accompanying photo, but anyone who knew me would recognize the school uniform. The article quoted Stella extensively about the warning signs she'd noticed and her difficult decision to involve authorities. School became unbearable after the article. Kids whispered wherever I went. Some called me an abuse defender. Others said worse things. During lunch, someone threw food at me while yelling that I was protecting a monster. The teachers pretended not to notice. Even my favorite English teacher avoided eye contact in the hallways. 2 weeks into my stay at Catherine and Jonathan's, they received an anonymous complaint. The envelope slid under their door contained a typed letter warning them about harboring a violent and unstable child who might harm their other foster kids. Catherine showed it to me with worried eyes. The typing looked familiar, but I couldn't prove Stella had sent it. By the weekend, my social worker had arranged a transfer to a different foster home. The second placement was stricter. Mr. and Mrs. Davidson ran their home like a detention center. No phone access, no computer time without direct supervision, and constant monitoring. They'd fostered difficult children before, they told me during intake. They knew how to handle kids with behavioral issues. Marcus showed up at my school the following Monday. He found me sitting alone at lunch, slipping into the seat across from me. His whispered words made my blood freeze. His mom had video footage from the family reunion, he warned. The security cameras at her parents' house had captured everything, including me asking for punishment. Out of context, it looked like a child trained to lie about discipline. He left as quickly as he'd appeared, but the damage was done. Dad's lawyer tried submitting my productivity logs as evidence, but the judge ruled them inadmissible hearsay. Without my direct testimony, which the court deemed too traumatic for me to provide, the spreadsheets meant nothing. Stella's lawyer argued the logs actually proved my father's obsessive control. Every piece of evidence I'd carefully collected got twisted into proof of his guilt. The CPS worker recommended terminating Dad's parental rights during a meeting I wasn't supposed to overhear. She cited severe psychological abuse and coercive control. The Davidsons had left their office door cracked, and I heard every word from the hallway. They discussed my refusal to acknowledge abuse and protective delusions about my father. Desperation drove me to attempt running away. I slipped out during a school bathroom break and made it halfway to my grandmother's house before a police officer spotted me. The failed escape earned me a new label, flight risk. The Davidsons couldn't handle flight risks, so I got transferred again. The group home was nothing like the foster placements. Ancient Oaks housed 12 kids between ages 13 and 17, most with histories of violence or severe behavioral problems. My roommate had assault charges. The boy down the hall sold substances. During my first night, someone stole my shoes. During the second, I learned to sleep with one eye open. Ms. Wilmort noticed the changes in me immediately. My English teacher had always been observant, but now she seemed genuinely concerned. She kept me after class one afternoon, closing the door carefully before speaking. She remembered when Stella's first stepson had been her student years ago. The same productivity rules, the same sudden removal from home, the same father blamed for everything. She'd kept files. 3 different kids over 8 years, all with the same strange documentation habits, all removed from their homes after reporting abuse by their fathers. All 3 had Stella as a stepmother. Ms. Wilmort had noticed the pattern but hadn't connected the dots until now. Together, we spent lunch periods in her classroom, building a timeline. 2 of Stella's previous victims agreed to speak with Ms. Wilmort, though they insisted on protection. Their stories mirrored mine exactly. Productivity spreadsheets, leather tool punishments, fathers who never fought back to avoid seeming violent. One showed scars that matched my bruises perfectly. The other described the same recording tactics Stella had used on me. My grandparents mortgaged their house to hire a better lawyer. The new attorney, Mr. Perkins, specialized in false accusation cases. He saw the patterns immediately and filed a motion to examine Stella's electronic devices. Her response was predictable. She claimed they'd been stolen in a break-in the previous week. No police report existed for this supposed theft. Brady cracked under the pressure at school. During a counseling session, he admitted to the school therapist that his mom had made him lie about my dad. The therapist called CPS immediately, but by the time they arrived, Stella was already there. She spun the story perfectly, claiming her children were traumatized by their exposure to an abusive household. Brady recanted everything when she stared at him. A forensic expert examined photos of my bruises at Mr. Perkins's request. The pattern, he explained in his report, was consistent with self-defense rather than attack. The angle and grouping suggested someone had grabbed my arms while I tried to protect myself, not the marks of an aggressive assault. The judge finally allowed this testimony. Stella's parents reached out to Mr. Perkins directly. They'd watched their daughter manipulate situations since childhood, they admitted. They provided psychiatric records from when she was 12, showing a pattern of lying and manipulation. The therapist's notes described a child who would injure herself to get others in trouble, who created elaborate stories to control situations. Panicking at her parents' betrayal, Stella filed a restraining order against them. Her parents kept records from when she was 12? That's quite the paper trail Stella left behind, and I'm curious why they stayed quiet through multiple stepchildren if they knew about these patterns all along. In her haste, she made a crucial mistake. The filing included an admission that she'd disciplined me for my own good. Mr. Perkins pounced on this detail, filing an emergency motion to re-examine the entire case. The judge ordered a new investigation, though I had to remain at Ancient Oaks during the process. The group home had become genuinely dangerous. Fights broke out daily, and I'd already been injured twice. The staff did their best, but they were overwhelmed and understaffed. Stella's carefully maintained image started cracking. Some of her Facebook supporters began questioning inconsistencies in her story. The support group she'd cultivated split into factions, with some defending her and others expressing doubts. She posted increasingly frantic updates, each one slightly contradicting the last. Brady showed up at my grandmother's house on a Tuesday evening. He'd run away from Stella's apartment, begging for forgiveness and help. He revealed what I'd suspected all along. She hit them too when I wasn't around. The productivity rules had simply shifted to focus entirely on them. Marcus had fresh bruises hidden under his sleeves. Stella filed kidnapping charges against my grandmother within hours. The police forced Brady to return to his mother, despite his protests. My grandmother's lawyer advised her not to interfere further, warning that Stella would use any excuse to have her arrested. Through a gaming platform that Stella didn't monitor, Marcus sent me a secret recording. He'd captured audio of Stella threatening Brady after his escape attempt. Her words were chilling and specific. She told him he'd end up like the others who'd talked, kids who'd tried to expose her before. The threat was clear, even if she never said exactly what would happen. A fight at Ancient Oaks left me with a black eye and bruised ribs. The hospital visit revealed something the previous examinations had missed: old injuries that had never been properly treated. The doctor's report detailed extensive bruising patterns consistent with strikes from a leather implement. The pattern matched Stella's tool exactly, down to the width and spacing of impact marks. Stella tried claiming I'd inflicted the injuries on myself for attention. She posted about self-harm and abuse victims, trying to get ahead of the story. But then Adam, one of her previous victims, broke his silence. He came forward with photos of scars from a decade ago, marks that matched mine precisely. The same tool, the same patterns, the same lies about self-infliction. 2 more victims emerged after local news coverage of Adam's revelation. The pattern was undeniable now. Each had productivity spreadsheets, leather tool marks, and fathers who'd been blamed for everything. Each had been removed from their homes and placed in foster care. Each had been labeled as delusional or protective of their abuser. The district attorney began considering criminal charges against Stella. She hired an expensive attorney who specialized in defending parents accused of abuse. Her narrative shifted again. Now she claimed she'd been protecting children from a violent man, using discipline as a last resort. The productivity rules were misunderstood parenting techniques designed to provide structure. Dad got released on electronic monitoring after 4 months in jail. Our first hug at the supervised visitation center lasted so long, the social worker had to remind us about time limits. He looked thinner, older, but his eyes still crinkled when he smiled. He whispered apologies I didn't need to hear. None of this was his fault. 3 days after Dad's release, Stella violated the custody order. She packed up Brady and Marcus in the middle of the night and disappeared. The note she left blamed a corrupt system that was failing to protect children. An Amber Alert went out immediately. Every news channel showed their school photos while describing them as endangered children. The manhunt lasted 6 days. State troopers found them at a motel 3 states away. Brady and Marcus were malnourished and dehydrated. Marcus had fresh bruises across his back and arms. Both boys were removed from Stella's custody immediately and placed in emergency care. Their father, who'd been fighting for custody since the divorce, finally got temporary placement. During their recovery, the boys revealed the extent of abuse they'd endured. It was worse than what I'd experienced. Stella had escalated after losing control of the situation. The productivity rules had become pretexts for constant punishment. She'd stopped feeding them regular meals, claiming they needed to earn food through productivity points. Marcus had lost 15 pounds in 2 months. The case gained national attention, though I tried to avoid the coverage. More victims contacted authorities from across the country. Stella had left a trail of traumatized stepchildren in multiple states, always moving on when things got too complicated, always finding new families to terrorize. The FBI took over the investigation when it became clear Stella had crossed state lines multiple times while perpetrating abuse. My carefully maintained documentation became key evidence in building a federal case. Thousands of texts, emails, and spreadsheet entries showed a clear pattern of systematic torture disguised as parenting. As the trial date approached, I spent hours preparing testimony with Mr. Perkins. He warned me that Stella's defense would try to discredit me, to paint me as a troubled teen making false accusations. But with multiple victims and extensive documentation, the truth was finally becoming undeniable. Stella maintained her innocence through it all. Even as evidence mounted, even as victim after victim came forward, she insisted she was being persecuted for trying to raise disciplined children. Her story changed constantly, but the core delusion remained. She was the victim, not us. The group home situation improved slightly after media attention focused on the case. Ancient Oaks received additional funding and hired more staff. I still didn't feel safe, but at least the daily fights decreased. My caseworker began working on reunification plans, though the process would take months of court hearings and evaluations. Ms. Wilmort organized a support group for Stella's victims. Our first meeting included 7 people, ranging from age 15 to 25. I was the youngest but had the most extensive documentation. We shared stories, compared scars, and slowly began to understand that none of us were alone in this experience. School became slightly more bearable as the truth emerged. Some kids apologized for their earlier behavior. Others maintained their distance but stopped actively harassing me. The guidance counselor who'd refused to believe me underwent mandatory training about recognizing female abusers and the complexity of family violence. Dad struggled with guilt during our supervised visits. He blamed himself for not protecting me, for not seeing through Stella's manipulations sooner. I tried explaining that she'd designed everything to prevent him from fighting back. Any resistance would have been twisted into evidence of violence. His passivity had been a trap she'd set, not a failing on his part. The investigation revealed more disturbing details about Stella's past. Her first husband had died under mysterious circumstances, leaving her with a substantial inheritance. Police had never investigated properly, accepting her story of a sudden illness. Now they were reopening that case, looking for patterns that might have been missed. As more evidence accumulated, Stella's defense strategy grew desperate. She claimed conspiracy, insisted all the victims had coordinated their stories, accused my father of orchestrating everything from jail. Each new theory contradicted the last, making her look increasingly unstable to observers. My productivity logs became a strange source of strength during this time. What had started as malicious compliance now served as irrefutable evidence. Every timestamp, every ridiculous entry about productive breathing or efficient blinking demonstrated the absurdity of Stella's system. The very thoroughness she demanded had become her downfall. Brady reached out through his dad, wanting to build a real relationship. We met at a neutral location with therapists present. He apologized repeatedly for his role in the manipulation. I told him he'd been a victim too. Stella had trained him from childhood to participate in her schemes. Breaking free took incredible courage. The foster care system slowly began to recognize its failures in my case. Multiple social workers had missed obvious signs, dismissing evidence that didn't fit their assumptions. Training programs were updated to address bias about female perpetrators and the complexity of psychological abuse. It felt like too little too late, but at least future kids might benefit. As the trial date neared, I focused on healing. Therapy with someone who actually listened helped process the trauma. I learned that hypervigilance and productivity obsession were trauma responses, not character flaws. Slowly, I began to reclaim parts of myself that Stella had tried to destroy. The other victims and I prepared for trial together. We practiced testimony, shared coping strategies, and reminded each other that truth would finally have its day. After months of being dismissed and disbelieved, we would finally be heard. The documentation we'd maintained, the scars we bore, and the stories we carried would expose Stella's pattern of abuse. Mr. Perkins built an airtight case. Physical evidence, documentation, witness testimony, and expert analysis all pointed to the same conclusion. Stella had systematically tortured children across multiple states for over a decade, using productivity rules as a mechanism for control and abuse. The leather tool was just one part of a comprehensive system designed to break children while maintaining plausible deniability. Stella's defense strategy reads like someone trying every excuse in the book while the book keeps catching fire. Mysterious dead husband, nationwide victim network, and productive breathing logs that turned her own crazy system into evidence against her. Dad's name was cleared in preliminary hearings. The judge formally apologized for the system's failure to protect an innocent man and his child. It didn't erase the months of separation or the trauma we'd endured, but it was a start. Plans for reunification moved forward, though I'd have to finish the school year at Ancient Oaks. Stella's parents testified about her childhood patterns of manipulation and violence. They'd tried to get her help, they explained, but she'd always been able to charm therapists and convince authorities that she was the victim. They'd watched her destroy multiple relationships and harm numerous people, feeling powerless to stop her. The investigation expanded to include financial crimes. Stella had taken money from several families, claiming it was for household expenses or children's needs. The funds had gone to personal purchases and legal fees from previous accusations. The pattern of exploitation extended beyond physical and psychological abuse. Marcus developed severe anxiety that required intensive treatment. The months of escalating abuse after I'd left had taken a terrible toll. He struggled with food, associating meals with punishment and productivity requirements. His recovery would take years, his therapist warned. More victims meant more evidence, but also more complexity. Coordinating testimony from people across the country required careful planning. Some victims couldn't afford to travel. Others were too traumatized to face Stella in court. The prosecution worked to accommodate everyone while building the strongest possible case. I marked my 18th birthday at Ancient Oaks with a small celebration organized by Ms. Wilmort. The other residents sang off-key while I blew out candles on a grocery store cake. It wasn't how I'd imagined becoming an adult, but surviving Stella's abuse and fighting for justice had forced me to grow up fast. The trial would begin in 3 weeks. Final preparations intensified as lawyers from both sides filed motions and counter-motions. Stella's defense team tried every possible tactic to delay or dismiss, but the judge denied most of their requests. Too much evidence existed to ignore. My father and I were finally allowed unsupervised visits as the reunification process progressed. We spent hours talking about everything except Stella at first, trying to rebuild our relationship without the shadow of trauma. Gradually, we began processing what had happened, supporting each other through the healing journey. The support group had grown to include 12 members. We met weekly, sharing progress and setbacks. Some days were harder than others. Triggers could come from unexpected places, like the sound of leather or spreadsheet software. But together, we found strength in shared experience and mutual understanding. As the trial approached, media coverage intensified. Reporters wanted interviews, but I declined most requests. This wasn't about fame or attention. It was about justice for all the children Stella had hurt and preventing her from hurting anyone else. The other victims felt similarly, though a few shared their stories hoping to help others recognize abuse. Stella made one last attempt to manipulate the narrative. She gave an unauthorized interview claiming she was a battered woman who'd been forced to discipline children by controlling men. The story fell apart quickly when reporters fact-checked her claims, but it showed she hadn't given up trying to twist reality to suit her needs. The trial date arrived on a gray Thursday morning. I sat in the witness waiting room at the courthouse, hands trembling as I reviewed my notes one last time. Mr. Perkins had prepared me extensively, but nothing could calm the churning in my stomach. Through the narrow window, I watched other witnesses arrive, including Adam and 2 more of Stella's previous victims. The prosecutor called me to testify first. Walking into the courtroom, I saw Stella sitting at the defense table in a conservative suit, her expression carefully neutral. She'd lost weight, and her usually perfect hair hung limp around her face. When our eyes met, she quickly looked away. I spent 4 hours on the stand, methodically describing the productivity torture. The prosecutor displayed my spreadsheets on large screens while I explained each entry. The jury members leaned forward as I demonstrated how Stella had weaponized documentation against me. Several jurors took extensive notes when I described the leather tool punishments. During cross-examination, Stella's lawyer tried painting me as a troubled teen seeking attention. He suggested I'd created the elaborate documentation system myself, that I'd misunderstood reasonable parenting as abuse. But Mr. Perkins had prepared me for these tactics. I remained calm, referring back to specific dates and evidence each time. The defense attorney grew increasingly frustrated as his strategies failed. When he implied I'd coached the other victims, Adam stood up in the gallery, shaking his head vigorously before the bailiff motioned him to sit. The lawyer's final attempt involved suggesting my father had orchestrated everything from jail, but even he seemed to realize how desperate that sounded. Brady and Marcus testified via closed-circuit television from another room. Their testimony proved devastating for Stella's defense. Brady described years of hidden abuse, productivity punishments that escalated whenever I wasn't around. Marcus, speaking barely above a whisper, detailed how his mother had stopped feeding them regular meals after I'd been removed from the home. The forensic expert presented his analysis of my bruise patterns. Using enlarged photographs and detailed measurements, he demonstrated how the marks could only have been made by someone striking me with a leather implement while I tried to protect myself. The width, spacing, and angle all matched Stella's tool exactly. Stella's own mother took the stand next. She brought childhood psychiatric records documenting her daughter's pattern of manipulation since age 12. She described incidents where young Stella had injured herself to get others in trouble, created elaborate lies to control situations. Her voice broke as she admitted they'd failed to get their daughter proper help. Dad testified about feeling trapped in an impossible situation. He explained how Stella had warned him that any resistance would be seen as violence, that no one would believe a man over a woman claiming abuse. He described watching me suffer while feeling powerless to intervene without making things worse. The prosecution presented thousands of productivity texts as evidence. A data analyst had created visualizations showing the escalating frequency and absurdity of my required documentation. The jury saw graphs depicting how the demands had intensified over time, becoming increasingly impossible to satisfy. Ms. Wilmort testified about the pattern she'd observed across multiple students over 8 years. She'd brought her carefully maintained files, showing how each child had exhibited the same documentation behaviors, the same sudden removal from their homes, the same fathers blamed for abuse. Her testimony established Stella's decade-long pattern across multiple states. On the third day of trial, the prosecution played Marcus's secret recording. Stella's voice filled the courtroom as she threatened Brady after his escape attempt. The specific nature of her threats, the cold calculation in her tone, made several jurors visibly uncomfortable. Even Stella's lawyer seemed shaken by the recording. More victims testified throughout the week. Each told remarkably similar stories. Productivity rules, leather tool punishments, fathers blamed and jailed. One victim from 8 years ago showed scars that still hadn't fully faded. Another described the lasting psychological impact, the difficulty trusting authority figures who'd failed to protect him. The prosecution's closing argument lasted 2 hours. The prosecutor methodically laid out the pattern of abuse, the systematic torture disguised as parenting, the calculated manipulation of the justice system. He emphasized how Stella had weaponized her psychology degree, using her understanding of the system to destroy families. Stella's defense made a final attempt to portray her as a misunderstood parent whose alternative techniques had been misinterpreted. Her lawyer argued that productivity rules weren't inherently abusive, that discipline had been taken out of context. But faced with overwhelming evidence from from multiple victims across multiple states, the argument fell flat. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours. When they filed back into the courtroom, none of them looked at Stella. The foreman stood and delivered guilty verdicts on all counts: child abuse, child torture, false reporting, custodial interference, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Each guilty verdict hit Stella like a physical blow. By the end, she sat slumped in her chair. At sentencing 2 weeks later, the judge called Stella's crimes the worst case of systematic child abuse he'd seen in 30 years on the bench. He specifically noted how she'd perverted her psychological training to torture children while maintaining plausible deniability. The sentence came down: 43 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Stella screamed as they led her away, ranting about ungrateful children and a corrupt system. Her words echoed through the courthouse halls until the heavy doors closed behind her. In the gallery, her victims sat in stunned silence. After years of not being believed, justice had finally arrived. The walk out of the courthouse felt surreal. Reporters crowded the steps, but Mr. Perkins guided us to a side exit. In the parking lot, the other victims and I stood in a loose circle, unsure what to say. Adam finally broke the silence, suggesting we get coffee to process what had just happened. That afternoon, I returned to Ancient Oaks to pack my belongings. Why would Stella scream about ungrateful children when she'd spent years documenting every tiny thing they did? That doesn't match someone who kept such careful records. Seems like her mask finally slipped completely when she lost control of the story she'd been telling herself all along. The reunification order had been finalized, and I could finally go home. My roommate helped me carry boxes to my dad's car. Several residents who'd followed the trial on the news wished me luck. Even the typically stern night supervisor smiled as I signed out for the last time. The drive home felt both endless and too quick. Dad and I didn't talk much, both processing the magnitude of what had just ended. When we pulled into our driveway, I saw he'd removed all traces of Stella from the exterior. New plants replaced the ones she'd insisted on. The productivity schedule that had hung by the door was gone. Inside, the house felt different, lighter somehow. Dad had packed away Stella's computer and the family spreadsheet system. My room remained exactly as I'd left it months ago, down to the homework still scattered on my desk. We spent that first evening in comfortable silence, ordering pizza and watching mindless television. Brady reached out the following week. He and Marcus were adjusting to life with their biological father, attending therapy sessions to process their trauma. Brady wanted to maintain contact, to build something real from the wreckage Stella had left. We started with simple text conversations, gradually working toward meeting in person. School felt strange after everything. Some classmates treated me like a hero, others like a curiosity. I focused on catching up academically, throwing myself into studies without the oppressive weight of productivity documentation. My grades improved when I could learn for the joy of it, rather than fear of punishment. The victims support group continued meeting monthly. We'd grown to 15 members as more people came forward after the trial. Some were considering civil suits against the agencies that had failed to protect them. Others just wanted to heal and move forward. We supported each choice, understanding that recovery looked different for everyone. 3 months after the trial, I received a letter from the district attorney's office. They were implementing new training protocols based on our case, teaching social workers and law enforcement to recognize signs of maternal abuse and coercive control. It wouldn't help us, but future victims might be believed sooner. Dad and I started family therapy to process our shared trauma. The therapist specialized in reunification after false accusations. We worked through his guilt about not protecting me, my anger at the system that had failed us, and our mutual fear that something like this could happen again. Slowly, we rebuilt trust in each other and in our ability to recognize manipulation. Ms. Wilmore invited me to speak to her new students about recognizing abuse in all its forms. I declined at first, not ready to relive the experience publicly, but eventually, I agreed to write an anonymous essay she could share. If my story could help even one kid recognize abuse and seek help, the pain would mean something. College applications loomed, but the trauma had affected my concentration. I struggled with essays, finding it hard to summarize myself beyond surviving Stella. My guidance counselor, the same one who'd refused to believe me, offered to help. His apology felt hollow, but I accepted the assistance. I needed to focus on my future, not past failures. Brady and I finally met in person 6 months after the trial. We chose a neutral location, a small cafe downtown. The conversation started awkwardly, both of us dancing around the enormous trauma we shared. But gradually, we found common ground in our recovery journeys. He was studying social work, hoping to help kids trapped in abusive situations. I decided to study law, inspired by Mr. Perkins and the legal team that had finally brought justice. The application essays came easier once I found my purpose. I wrote about learning that documentation could be both a weapon of control and a tool for justice, about the importance of believing victims even when their stories seemed improbable. The acceptance letter to my dream school arrived on a Tuesday. Dad and I celebrated quietly, both understanding what this meant. I'd survived Stella's torture, fought through a system designed to dismiss me, and emerged with purpose. The scholarship they offered would cover most expenses, removing financial pressure from our fresh start. As I prepared for college, I maintained contact with the support group and some of the other victims. We'd formed an unlikely family, bonded by shared trauma but not defined by it. Some were thriving, others still struggling, but all were free from Stella's control. That freedom, hard-won through documentation and determination, meant everything. The productivity spreadsheets remained in evidence storage, thousands of entries cataloging torture disguised as parenting. Sometimes I wondered if Stella understood the irony, how her demand for obsessive documentation had ultimately exposed her. But mostly, I focused on building a life where productivity meant personal growth, not survival. My story inspired a few other victims to come forward about their own abusive mothers. The detective who'd worked our case told me they'd opened 3 new investigations based on similar patterns. The system was slowly learning to recognize that abuse has no gender, that mothers could be perpetrators too. On my last night before college, Dad and I burned the few remaining items connected to Stella. The leather tool went into the fire first, followed by printed spreadsheets we'd kept as backup evidence. We watched them turn to ash, a symbolic end to that chapter of our lives. The scars would always remain, but they no longer defined us. Moving into my dorm room felt like stepping into a new life. My roommate knew nothing about my past, saw me as just another freshman nervous about starting college. I kept it that way, choosing to build new relationships without the weight of trauma. The past had shaped me but wouldn't limit my future. I excelled in my pre-law classes, finding strength in understanding the system that had failed me. Constitutional law, criminal procedure, family law, each Each course added tools to my arsenal. My professors noted my unusual dedication to cases involving children and domestic abuse. One offered me a research position focusing on gender bias in abuse cases. Brady graduated with his social work degree while I was in my junior year. He'd specialized in recognizing signs of maternal abuse, developing screening tools that didn't assume fathers were always perpetrators. We collaborated on a presentation for his department, combining his practical experience with my legal research. During my final year, I interned at the prosecutor's office that had handled Stella's case. They assigned me to work on cases involving coercive control and psychological abuse. My personal experience, combined with legal training, helped identify patterns others might miss. Several cases resulted in successful prosecutions. The bar exam loomed after graduation. I studied with the same intensity I'd once applied to productivity logs, but now the motivation came from within. When results arrived showing I'd passed on the first attempt, Dad threw a small celebration. We'd both come so far from that day the police had dragged him away in handcuffs. My first job was with a nonprofit providing legal aid to abuse victims. The pay was modest, but the work felt meaningful. I specialized in cases where mothers were the abusers, helping fathers and children navigate a system still biased toward maternal custody. Each successful case felt like a small victory against the injustice we'd faced. 5 years after the trial, I received notice that Stella had filed an appeal. Her new lawyer claimed ineffective counsel and procedural errors. The other victims and I prepared to testify again if needed, but the appellate court reviewed the extensive evidence and denied her appeal without hearing. The conviction stood. I stayed in touch with Marcus, who'd struggled more than Brady with recovery. He'd developed an eating disorder related to Stella's food control, requiring years of treatment, but he'd finally entered college, studying nutrition with hopes of helping others with trauma-related food issues. His recovery inspired my continued work. At a conference on domestic violence, I presented a paper on recognizing coercive control in parental abuse. The room was packed with social workers, law enforcement, and legal professionals. As I explained how productivity requirements could mask torture, I saw recognition dawn on several faces. Perhaps they'd missed similar cases. 10 years after that family reunion where everything had exploded, I stood before the state Supreme Court. The case involved expanding the definition of child torture to include systematic psychological abuse through impossible requirements. I'd written the brief myself, drawing on personal experience and years of legal precedent. Brady sat in the gallery, now a respected social worker who'd helped dozens of children escape abusive homes. Dad was there too, gray-haired but proud. Several of Stella's other victims had come to watch. As I argued for recognizing productivity abuse as torture, I thought about that scared teenager documenting every breath. The justices asked pointed questions about defining psychological torture, about preventing overreach while protecting children. I answered with confidence born from lived experience and legal expertise. When they announced their unanimous decision weeks later, productivity abuse became recognized as a form of child torture under state law. The media called it Stella's Law, though I'd pushed for a different name. What mattered was that future children trapped in similar situations would have legal recourse. Obsessive documentation requirements, impossible productivity standards, punishment for normal human needs, all now constituted recognized abuse. That night, I sat with my own legal briefs spread across my desk, working on my next case. Talk about turning lemons into a whole legal career. Our narrator went from tracking bathroom breaks to tracking down justice for others stuck in similar nightmares. The irony wasn't lost on me, this voluntary productivity after years of forced documentation. But now, each hour of work meant another child might be believed, another family might find justice. Stella had taught me the power of documentation. I'd simply turn that weapon around, using meticulous records to expose abuse rather than enable it. And in that reversal lay my greatest victory, proving that sometimes the most powerful resistance is to follow an abuser's rules so perfectly that you expose the insanity beneath them. That's an interesting thought. I can't help but wonder if there's something else driving all these extra hours beyond just helping others. Guess we'll never know for sure. But hey, thanks for sticking around to dive into all this with me. CTA, like the video. It helps more than you think.